Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Special Project Manager, and I'd like to welcome you to Moment Happy Hour for today's Zoominar, Israeli Politics Today. How did we get here, and where are we going? Please note that today's conversation is being recorded, and we will post it later this week. Towards the end of the session, we will open up the conversation, so please start typing your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find on your screen. After today's program, you can find many Israel-related articles on our website at momentmag.com. And while you're there, sign up for the Jewish Politics and Power newsletter that includes weekly reporting and analysis from Guttman. We also ask that you consider making a donation to help support our ongoing effort to bring you new and engaging opportunities like today's conversation. And don't forget to subscribe to the magazine. Finally, please join us next Tuesday, June 16th, for our next Zoominar with Esther Safran Foer, who will be in conversation with former NPR co-host Robert Siegel about her newly released book, I Want You to Know We're Still Here, a post-Holocaust memoir. On June 30th, World War Z author Max Brooks will join us to discuss his upcoming book, Evolution. And come July, Michael Levine will be rejoining us for a 3-part Broadway series. Now for today's conversation, Israeli Politics Today. How did we get here, and where are we going? I'd first like to introduce Moment Institute Senior Fellow, Natan Guttman. Natan is the U.S. correspondent for Israel's Public Broadcasting Corporation and has served as Washington Bureau Chief for the Forward, Haaretz, and the Jerusalem Post. His award-winning reporting has included coverage of the highs and lows of the Middle East peace process, the role of Jewish interest in U.S. politics. Natan has provided commentary on Israeli politics, the Middle East, and the Jewish community on CNN, MSNBC, BCC, NPR, and other U.S. and international outlets. Joining Natan today is Sarah Breger, Deputy Editor of Moment and the Director of the Daniel Pearl Investigative Initiative. Sarah has won numerous awards, including first place for Religion Reporting of the Year from the Religion News Association, and first place for Best In-Depth News Writing on Religion from the American Academy of Religion. Please welcome Natan Guttman and Sarah Breger.
Thanks, Suzanne, and thank you very much for organizing this. Some of you may know that Moment is actually celebrating its 45th anniversary. And as part of that, I've been going through our archives. And one thing I discovered the other day was that Moment has done 3 cover stories on explaining the Israeli electoral process to its American audience and explaining why it's so confusing. So I was just struck that this, in some ways, is not an evergreen topic. And even though we talk about how unusual this past year has been, obviously it's something that has been on people's minds for a long time. Natan, I was hoping you could briefly explain the Israel's electoral process and electoral system, and maybe how we got to 3 elections in 1 year.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. Thanks so much. It's a question we get all the time. Explain the system. Why is your system so unusual? It's unusual when you look at it from America because it's very different, but it's basically a European-style parliamentary system, which means that the person who is elected to be prime minister isn't elected directly by the people, but he is the head of the largest party or the party who wins the most seats in the election, or, since that never happens, the head of the party that can create a coalition in which he controls the majority of seats in the Knesset. The Knesset is the Israeli parliament. It has 120 seats, which means that you need at least 61. That's your magic number. If you have 61 seats, you can form a coalition. This coalition will usually be made up of 1 or 2 large parties. The head of the biggest party will usually be the prime minister, and then they'll add on whatever other parties that sort of fit in ideologically and can bring you to this magic number of 61. When you vote in Israel, much easier than voting here. You don't have to check 20 different boxes. You don't have to go through pages. It's one note that you put in the ballot box. and it has the name of the party that you're electing. And that's all you do. This party has a list of members that will go to the Knesset based on the number of seats that it wins in the election. Now, it sounds pretty straightforward. It gets complicated because you need to build a coalition. And ideally, you'd have one big party. And in the early days of Israel, some call them the good old days, some the bad old days, but you had that basically the Labor Party, or whatever name it went under at the time, that had the majority of the votes and could easily form a coalition. Nowadays, Israeli political map is very fractured. So as we'll see in a second, it's hard to get even close to 60 or 50 or 40 seats. 30 seats would be considered good, which means they have to start collecting all these other parties in order to form a coalition. And it usually works. This time it didn't work. And that's why we've seen this ongoing crisis, 508 days of basically no ruling government in Israel, in 3 election cycles, which were basically indecisive. And eventually it led to this national unity government that we're in now. So that's the system in short. It sounds complicated. Many Americans tell me that, well, it's really a weird system that you have. And then I remind them that in the system in America, you have someone who got less votes, 3 million less votes than the other person, and he becomes president. So, depends what your perspective is.
Wasn't there a period where you voted separately for the prime minister and for, the party you were interested in?
Yeah, that went on for 2 election cycles, this idea of reforming the system. The thought was that you want to give less power to the small parties, and therefore you can choose directly, elect directly your prime minister. It was in the late 90s, early 2000s, and it was reverted afterwards because the system, or at least those who make the rules, didn't think that the system was working. And one other thing we should also mention is that elections in Israel are national. You don't have your district or your county or state represented. You vote for a national list.
So in terms of this current government, we went from possibly having a sort of a Kachol Lavan led coalition, which sort of seemed it could be possible after the first election, especially after the first election and maybe after the second. But then after the third, things just took a turn. And then we had, and we ended up with this coalition government between Benny Gantz, who had said, I'm never going to serve with Netanyahu, and Netanyahu. Can you explain how that came to be?
Yeah, and in a second, I'll put up maybe just the results of the current elections, and maybe we can do it even right now. Just one second here. I am disabled from sharing screens, so if Suzanne can help us with that, maybe. And meanwhile, basically, here's where Israeli politics is for right now. And just please 1 second, if you'll bear with me, I will share this screen here, which is somewhere here. No, here it is. I'm sorry. So we can look at the results together and then have a better sense of where we are. So this is what came out of this recent round of elections, which we should remind is the 3rd time in a year and a half that Israelis went to the election, basically because it's split in the middle. Now, in general, what do we have in the Israeli political system right now? We have the right wing, which is led by the Likud. We have the center, it's called here center left, but I'd say center, led by what used to be Kachol Lavan as a big party, Benny Gantz's party. And then you have other smaller parties that we'll talk about in a second. Now, basically, what these elections were about, all 3 of them were kind of a referendum on the prime minister, on Netanyahu as prime minister. Because there was less ideology in it and more personality. And basically, the centrist bloc that Benny Gantz formed, it's a new party, they called it Blue and White, kind of a construct of 3 different parties, one led by Benny Gantz, who came from the military, has no experience in politics, but is kind of considered to be well-liked and appreciated by the Israeli public. He set up his party, then they joined Yair Lapid's center, kind of center-left, but basically center party that already existed and was doing pretty well. And they joined a smaller party headed by Bogi Ya'alon, Moshe Ya'alon, also a former general who broke off from the Likud and set up another small party. And this together formed this party that had basically one piece in its ideology or in its platform, which was not Bibi. Their main point, and what they were telling the Israeli people, is that Netanyahu is accused of corruption. He's facing a corruption trial. He is not worthy to serve as prime minister. He has to be kicked out. That was what Kahol Lavan went to the, Kahol Lavan means blue and white, by the way, went to the elections on, and that's where they started. Likud, on the other hand, is a classic right-wing in the Israeli sense, kind of nationalistic party. And then you have other smaller parties, some of them, like you see here, Shas or UTJ, the United Torah party. These are ultra-Orthodox religious parties. Yemina, you can see here, is a more settler-oriented right-wing party. On the other hand, you have the joint list, very interesting. That's the joint list mainly of Israeli Arab parties, 4 Israeli Arab parties running together, an extraordinary outcome there with 15 seats. And those 7 seats that you see on the bottom, Labor, Gesher, Meretz, we'll talk about them soon, but basically that's what's left from the Israeli left, and even that doesn't exist anymore. We'll get to that. So we have these elections time and time again, and it's always a tie because we have this 7-seat party here, Yisrael Beitenu, led by Avigdor Lieberman, basically makes him the kingmaker because he could go with either side. Ideologically, he's a little more to the right, but he can't stand Bibi, so he's a little more to Gantz's side. And he could be the kingmaker, but he chose to sit out these first 2 rounds and basically the third one also because he doesn't want to go with Bibi, but on the other hand, he won't go with Gantz if Gantz goes with the Arab parties. So we're stuck with this stalemate. And that's where we were for the longest time, until about a month and a half ago, in which it was time basically for Benny Gantz to either form a narrow government based on the votes of his own party, the joint list and the left, or to give it over to Netanyahu, who didn't have enough votes either, as we see, he has only 58, or to go to a 4th round of elections. And that's where basically Benny Gantz caved in. He said, Israel can't go to another round of elections. The Israeli public just can't stand that idea. And therefore, I'm going to compromise. I'm going to compromise on the main issue that I ran for these elections, the idea that Israel cannot be led by Benjamin Netanyahu. And he said, okay, I'm joining what they called a national emergency government led by Netanyahu. Why emergency? Because all this is happening as the coronavirus pandemic is hitting Israel and the world. And that was either a reason or an excuse or some kind of ladder to get off this tree that Gantz climbed on. This excuse for joining a coalition, explaining basically to his voters that given the dire situation that Israel is in, the need to fight the pandemic, the need to restore the economy somehow, he's willing to swallow his pride and his platform and join Netanyahu government with the promise that 18 months from now, they will rotate and he will become prime minister, Netanyahu will become his deputy.
So, well, one small question with that is that, you know, I saw a recent poll that 2/3 of Israelis don't think that Netanyahu will give up his prime ministership when it comes time in November 2021.
Right.
Is it possible for him to renege on the deal? And how would that lead to new elections, or would that lead to something else?
Well, one of the obstacles when they tried to negotiate this national emergency government was how do you assure that this doesn't happen, that come 18 months from now, Netanyahu will say, I'm just not giving up my seat. And well, I mean, not to be too blunt, but Netanyahu has a history of not sticking to political deals when the need came. So there was good reason to believe that Netanyahu won't live up to his end of the deal. And also, we need to remember that Netanyahu, and we'll get to that in a second, all this is happening as Netanyahu is facing a criminal process in the Israeli district court in Jerusalem. And these timetables kind of collide. 18 months from now, Netanyahu may very well be at a point in which he's facing his verdict already, or close to that, in that trial. He definitely will have the incentive not to go ahead with this swap, because as long as he's prime minister, he's in a better position to delay, to postpone, to make sure that he doesn't, if convicted, of course, that he doesn't go to jail. So he has the incentive to do it. It would be difficult. The coalition agreement kind of locks him into this swap, but not impossible. And I mean, not to be too cynical about it, but Israel is a country that faces security risks all the time. And God forbid something happens 18 months from now, I think the Israelis will be open to a message from Netanyahu saying, this is not the time to switch your prime minister when we're facing a threat from Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, name it. So it could happen, but it's very unlikely. And if it does happen, there's always a threat of new elections if Benny Gantz can rebuild his old Kahol Lavan party and force elections.
Although I read a poll today that I think if they did elections today, Likud would win now, which I'm not sure how reliable it was, but that was interesting. And how does the switch? Now Benny Gantz is alternate prime minister, which I'm not exactly sure what that means. He's also a defense minister.
Yeah.
But what power does he have? And then also when they switch, Netanyahu, should also be able to kind of like kick down his sort of prosecution down the road, because he still is technically a prime minister. So how does that work?
Right. So first of all, this idea of alternate prime minister is just basically a title that they invented for this unique situation. So it's supposedly somehow more binding than deputy or vice. It really means that he has a title right now, but it doesn't matter much. Basically, Gantz is defense minister right now, and he has all the responsibilities of the defense ministry, which is arguably the most important portfolio in the Israeli government. It always has been. And he's, of course, the senior member of the inner cabinet, because one of the problems of this coalition process is that it was so complicated to build this national emergency coalition that you had to give out cabinet seats to so many members and so many fractions and so many other parts of the party. So you ended up with a government that has 35 cabinet positions. With the funniest name, you have a minister for water affairs, and you have a ton of deputy ministers. So in order to make this manageable, there's an inner cabinet within the cabinet. And that's where decisions are made, and that's where Benny Gantz is the number 2 in this inner cabinet, and he has more power to influence decisions on these issues. So basically, that's where he is right now in terms of the power that he has within the government. And if and when this swap happens, this rotation happens in a year and a half from now, then he will become prime minister, and Netanyahu will assume the role of the alternate prime minister. There's a legal problem here, because weirdly enough, you can probably be prime minister in Israel even if you're convicted or charged with criminal charges, but you can't be a minister. So because that was already ruled in the past in some different case. So we will face some kind of a legal showdown when we reach that point, again, if Netanyahu is convicted.
That's so interesting. In terms of, you mentioned kind of this bloated cabinet. how does the Israeli public react to this? Because I mean, it's not just the title. It's, you know, money comes along with all of that.
Right.
So the spending for all these new ministers is tremendous. And I mean, now, you know, Israel's very worried about its economy. How are people reacting to that?
Very negatively. Basically, Israelis came out of this last round of elections and of coalition negotiations very, very disappointed, very angry at the system, and especially when they saw this huge inflated government, because as you mentioned, you know, each one of these portfolios, as significant or insignificant as it is, it comes with a huge operation around it. You know, you have staff and you have people working with you, and even though the most insignificant ministry has these things, and it's millions and millions of shekels at a time when, like everywhere else around the world, there's huge unemployment in Israel. Great parts of the Israeli economy basically grinded to a halt because of the pandemic. And at this time, to come and spend so much money, it's really infuriating for many Israelis. Now, true that when you look at the bigger picture, these are many millions, but it doesn't really even reach the surface of the bigger issues that the economy faces, the billions and billions of shekels that are being lost. So it's not as if that would make the difference, but symbolically, it's very important, especially since this kind of Gantz and Netanyahu labeled this as this emergency cabinet, and we're only here because we need to save the country from the pandemic. And then they go and give out all these cabinet positions that only cost millions and don't have much use.
As a side note, I do have to say what a positive of that is that there's the first, first ultra-Orthodox woman to be a minister, and there's the first Ethiopian-born woman to be a minister. Right. So it is nice that there is room for these underrepresented voices.
Definitely, and they're both very talented women, I should say, and it is noteworthy. But again, I don't think the purpose of expanding the government so much was to give them these positions. That was kind of a side product of it, a byproduct.
The map that you showed us, or the election results, were interesting because if you looked at a thing, how everything sort of played out in the end, everything is flipped because the joint party is on one side, and then you have the joint, like the Kahol Lavan is split with Likud. The joint list is on its own. Labor is with Bibi. So I'm just fascinated how this kind of mix happened. And just to focus a little bit on like Israel's left, Labor ultimately decided to go with Bibi. And, Amir Peretz, the head of Labor, had sort of said very strongly, I'm not going to go with Bibi. He even shaved his, he has a famous mustache, and he shaved it to do a read my lips. I'll never be with Bibi. But now he is. And so I'm curious, like, what's the future of the Israeli left?
Yeah, that's a huge question. And first of all, I think we kind of skipped through the question of what happened to Kahol Lavan. Not sure everyone followed that closely. Basically, when we reached the moment of the need to either go to the fourth elections or to join this national unity government, Kahol Lavan split. Benny Gantz said, I don't want another set of elections. I'm joining Netanyahu. His biggest partner, Yair Lapid and Yesh Atid, decided they're not going to go. So the party split basically, with Gantz and Kahol Lavan taking their 16 seats, joining Netanyahu's coalition. Yair Lapid taking the other 17 seats and staying in the opposition. And then you have this block here of the Labor Gesher Meretz. How do we get to even having this? Israeli politics used to be easy. You had like right and left, Likud and Labor. And then to the left of the Labor, you'd have the peace camp parties. In recent decades, there were basically Meretz. It was that party. And to the left of them, you'd have the communists and the Arab parties that were, at least on the issue of Israel-Palestine, they were more to the left. But this phenomena of the ever-shrinking Israeli left just became so dramatic that in order to make it through the elections, and there is a threshold in the Israeli elections, so you need to get at least 4 seats, or what works out to be 4 seats in order to be in the Knesset. And facing this last round of elections, Meretz had real concerns that they're not going to pass, they're not going to get these 4 seats, and they might be wiped out. And the Labour Party under Amir Peretz, which used to be the biggest party in Israel for decades, also thought they'd get wiped out. So they joined forces with this thing called Gesher, which is a party by Orly Levy Abeksis. She broke off a right-wing party. She's the daughter of David Levy, who used to be a very senior member of the Likud, and a very impressive lawmaker on social issues. She came from the far right, basically, to join this weird group. What happened after the elections is that it all broke up. So you had the 3 seats of Meretz still staying there, and that's basically the Israeli left. Now, out of the 120 seats, this is the Israeli Zionist left. You had Labor, Ben-Gurion's Labor, Rabin's Labor, Peres joining Netanyahu with 2 of their 3 seats. Merav Michaeli stayed in the opposition, and Orly Levy Abeksis, the Gesher party, basically also going back to her roots on the right wing. So is there an Israeli left now? Politically, there isn't an Israeli left. There's a centrist contingency led by either Gantz or Yair Lapid, but they're definitely not left. And the question is, what does it mean in terms of what we see, at least, or many in the world see as the biggest issue that Israel is facing, which is its conflict with the Palestinians. Again, it used to be easier. You used to have half the political body was left wing, meaning supporting a 2-state solution, territorial compromise, and half was right wing, meaning supporting either not deciding on that or annexation, and definitely supporting the idea of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. That no longer exists, this division. And right now, we can talk about it a little later when we get to the whole issue of annexation. Right now, basically, the Israeli Knesset, and frankly, the Israeli public, are all, or majority, what we used to call right-wing, meaning skeptical or opposed to the 2-state solution, willing to accept or even warmly embracing the idea of Israeli annexation of the entire West Bank or parts of it. And you have this small group there of whatever is left from Meretz and the joint list of the Arab parties that are the stronger supporters of what used to be the Israeli left.
You mentioned the joint list. They're pretty strong. They have 15 seats. Right. But I'm curious how Israeli Arabs are feeling now. They came out to vote in huge numbers, more than they ever have before. They gained a lot of political power, but then, Gantz sort of turned away to go with Netanyahu. Are they feeling betrayed or disillusioned, or is it just another in a long list of things?
No, frankly, I mean, I don't know what Israeli Arabs feel in their heart, but I'm sure that at this point, they're way beyond the disappointment from anything that the Israeli political system has to offer. But they are in an interesting crossroads right now, because they overcame the main obstacle of Israeli Arab representation, which was low turnout and internal fractures. So it used to be an issue where they had significantly lower turnout than the Jewish population in Israel. And then that would be divided between 2, 3, 4 smaller parties, basically one nationalistic, one communist, one closer to the Muslim Brotherhood. You have these smaller parties. Now they managed to join and raise the turnout in a way that made them a very significant power. They're still not voting in rates that compare to the Jewish population, but they're very close to that. And that's why they they came with, they reached this incredible result of 15 seats, which gives them a lot of power. And the leadership, I think, of Ayman Odeh as the main voice now of the of Israeli Arabs in the political scene is also very effective. He's younger. He's very well versed in social media and in conversing with Jewish Israelis and with the world. And he has a vision of how to make the political voice of Israeli Arabs heard. However, at the end of the day, Israeli Arabs still face the same type of exclusion, racism, whatever you may call it, that leaves them outside of this coalition map. And I think they did have for a moment some hope that Benny Gantz would maybe not even consider them as part of his coalition, but part of this outside bloc of supporters that would allow him to become prime minister and would make them part of the political discussion in a more effective way. And I think they learned that even this, you can be centrist, you can be moderate on many other issues, but even now within the Israeli center, not to mention the right, joining forces with the Arab parties on a political level is difficult.
And now they're part of the opposition, which is led by Yair Lapid.
Right.
And it's kind of an odd mix of people, because it's them, it's Yamina, which is a very right-wing party, it's Meretz, Yesh Atid. How is that going to work? Are they going to be an actual opposition party, or is it just going to be, opposition parties with everyone kind of fighting their own battles?
Well, I think for most issues, they'll be fighting their own battles because they have different agendas. If you reach a point, I guess the question is, what happens if we reach a point in which Benny Gantz says, I had it. Bibi Netanyahu is not living up to the agreement, or is doing whatever he wants, or this is not this is not the deal I entered with them. I want out. I want to and then it goes to some kind of a vote of confidence in the Knesset, in which they would have to join Gantz basically in trying to topple Netanyahu. Will they do that, all of them together? It's difficult. It depends what the issue is, because as you mentioned, they come from all ends of the political map. So let's say there's something that has to do with a peace plan or some initiative with the Palestinians that Gantz feels that Israel should accept and Netanyahu is against. So I guess some parts of the opposition will join him, the joint list, of course, Meretz, maybe parts of Yesh Atid, but then Yamina won't. What happens if it's another issue? So it's difficult, and historically opposition in Israel isn't very effective, especially now with a very broad coalition and a big government in Israel. It's hard to see the opposition actually advancing its own agenda or threatening Netanyahu in any significant way.
So I know we need to get to questions, but I think we have to talk about annexation for at least a few minutes before we do. There's a July 1st, is it a July 1st deadline that for it to sort of come before the Knesset to start discussing it. Is that going to happen? Is that something that Benny Gantz is in favor of?
Well, let's define annexation. The Israeli government doesn't like to use the term annexation. They make up other terms for it, but it's annexation. It's basically taking the Palestinian areas west of the 1967 border and applying the Israeli law to them, basically turning them into part of Israel. The annexation program we're talking about right now is partial. It's not the entire West Bank. It's the Jordan Valley, and I wish I had your map, but you have a map in your head. It's the Jordan Valley that goes along the border between Israel and Jordan, and then the settlements, the Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which are, most of them are concentrated in 3 settlement blocks, but they're also scattered all over, the smaller one. And the plan, which is derived from Donald Trump's deal of the century, the vision for a Middle East peace, basically says that these areas will be part of Israel in any future peace agreement, and therefore Israel can annex them right now. And that's what Netanyahu would like to advance right now. He set a deadline of July 1st. There's a mapping commission that's actually working on the ground with the Americans to do that. And it's not set in stone, this July 1st deadline. I saw today someone suggesting maybe you should do it on July 4th as a gift to Donald Trump. Maybe that would be. You can choose any date, but it's in the works. And here's where it gets a little complicated. So Benny Gantz, I don't think that Benny Gantz is a huge supporter of the idea of unilateral annexation. For him, he either really believes in it or uses it as an excuse that this is part of a bigger step, which is accepting the Trump peace plan, taking whatever land that will probably be part of Israel in any final agreement, even though this is way more generous than any other agreement that we discussed and something that the Palestinians won't even hear about, and entering some kind of a negotiation process with the Palestinians towards a two-state solution. So that's his interpretation of it. It's hard to believe that he's very serious about it because Palestinians really made clear that they're not going to negotiate on the basis of this plan. So the only thing you'll be left with is Israeli annexation. And then we also need to keep in mind also the international and the regional reaction to that. So for many Israelis and for Netanyahu, and I think there's some sense to this argument, but basically the world starts and ends at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and that's what matters. And there's some truth there, because that's Israel's, the United States, the White House, that's Israel's main supporter in terms of political, diplomatic, military aid, whatever. So for Netanyahu, he doesn't really care what the world thinks because he has Donald Trump on the side. Gantz may be looking at other voices. The European Union is very strongly against this. United Nations Security Council will be against it. The moderate Arab countries that in the Gulf that Netanyahu has been getting closer and closer to them in the past decade, they're against it. More significantly, Jordan is strongly against it, and Jordan is stability and good relations with Jordan are a main Israeli interest. And of course, the Palestinians are against it. They already announced that because of this annexation plan, they're pulling out of all agreements with Israel. It's not really clear what it means on the ground right now, but this could bring the collapse of the Palestinian Authority and cause chaos in the territories. And Benny Gantz, as a former military chief of staff, as someone who knows, I think, better than anyone else, what it means to have instability in the West Bank and in Gaza, I think this part of the equation could play a role in his decision-making process. So I don't think ideologically he has a big problem with annexation, but he may be convinced as we get closer to that date that it's too risky in terms of the international and the regional implications of it.
And I guess what happens if there's a new president in the White House? Is Netanyahu trying to rush it through beforehand, or would Biden just kind of continue on with what's happening?
Definitely, he's going to rush it through before. There will be no annexation under a Democratic president if Biden wins the election. He said so himself. Biden was on record saying that he opposes the annexation. All Democrats do, not only the progressive wing, but also Nancy Pelosi's on record saying that they are strongly opposed to unilateral Israeli annexation, and they won't let Israel go ahead with it if there's a new president in the White House come January. But we're in June now, so there's still enough time to do this before. Now, it seems, I guess the big question right now regarding the annexation is where does President Trump stand on the issue? Obviously, he put out his plan. This plan enables annexation. He doesn't seem to have the attention span right now to deal with Middle East peacemaking when everything else is going on. So he could either say, just do whatever you want, leave it to Ambassador Friedman in Israel and to Netanyahu and they'll take it from there. Or he could also say, no, this would just cause another problem and another world hotspot that I'm not sure I have to deal with right now. And he may gently or forcefully tell Netanyahu, no, just wait with that. Don't do it right now. And then it will be interesting to see what happens.
Yes, that's true. Okay, let's turn to questions. It looks like we have a bunch.
Yeah.
So we're gonna start kind of back from the beginning. We'll take as many as we can get to. But people had some questions with regards to the chart you put up, Natan. I'm gonna put 4 of these questions together just because they're all related.
Okay.
Why is the National Religious Party not on your chart? Where would the open Orthodox slate fit into all of this? Sarah, you mentioned that the Arabs, the Israeli Arabs have more power now with 15 seats, and someone wants to know why is 15 seats considered a lot of power? And then lastly, will there be any move to improve the electoral process, such as fewer parties in the future?
So I'll start. I guess the two first questions were basically about the Orthodox representation in the Knesset. And between these 3 election cycles that we went through in the last year and a half, we saw a lot of mergers and then blocks dissolving, and that affected mainly the Orthodox and the right-wing secular parties. Basically, again, in the past, we used to have the Haredi parties, the ultra-Orthodox parties, which are now, used to be 1, now there are 2, UTJ and Shas that we see here on the chart. And by the way, I should stop for a second and say, I stole this chart from Haaretz, and they deserve credit for it. And hopefully it's okay with them. So we used to have 1 or 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, and then we used to have the modern Orthodox, open Orthodox, Mafdal Orthodox, national religious Zionist parties. They had all these different names, and they used to be the bigger power within this bloc. Currently, what we had in this election is basically all these modern Orthodox parties fold into Yemina, which is Orthodox but settler oriented and not only Orthodox, and that's also kind of telling of where Israeli politics is right now, where the modern Orthodox who used to be represented in the Labour Party and in the Likud and were we used to have more views and opinions within that group, now pretty much coalesces around the right of center / settler parties. So all of those are in Yemina, and of course many modern Orthodox support the Likud, Israel Beiteinu a little bit. There are some that support Gantz and Kahol Lavan, so they're in other places as well. Sarah, do you want to take the one about the Arab Party, or?
Sure. I was just going to ask one question to you if we're talking about the Orthodox Party. How did Shas and UTJ do in terms of power and like the dividing up of the ministries? It seemed like they got a few very important ministries.
Yes, basically they got to keep pretty much what they wanted. In UTJ, that for the past health ministry, with Litzman, decided to give that one up, and the Israeli ministry that's parallel to HUD, the housing ministry. Could be that it had to do with the fact that not too many people were pleased by the way Litzman was running or managing the pandemic situation, but also in terms of needs and interest of the communities that they represent. Housing is also very significant. Shas, again, focusing on the interior department where Aryeh Deri will be the minister. Again, that's traditionally a Shas position, and again, has to do also with their interests and also with the needs of their constituency.
And then just in terms of the joint list, I mean, if you look, I think they're the third largest bloc. And so if you think about it that way, you know, if you're trying to go and trying to sway people or sway votes, they're a good party to get on your side. One thing that's interesting is that some Jewish Israelis voted for the joint Arab list in March. So I don't know if that shows kind of a disappointment or a disgust with, you know, the Israeli left that exists now, or something else. But I thought that was fascinating.
It is, and I think yes, it has to do with the fact that for some Israelis on the left end of what we used to call the peace camp, they had the feeling that Meretz is either too weak or not focused enough on this issue. They had concerns that it might not pass the threshold, that joining forces with Orly, Levy Abekassis, and with in labor wouldn't really serve the cause of advancing a two-state solution. So you saw those are among the reasons that led Jewish voters to vote for the joint list. That actually has at least, I think, one member who is Jewish from the Communist Party faction of the party. Should we go back to more questions?
So Sarah, would you want to answer the reason why you feel that the 15 seats yield a lot of power?
Well, because it's the third largest bloc. So, you know, if you're trying to get votes or trying to convince someone of something, having, you know, a group of 15 votes already on your side kind of can help, you know, sway to one side or the other.
Mm-hmm. And Natan, back to that question about, do you think at any point the electoral process will be reformed and maybe less parties?
We already have less parties, and the threshold has been updated and increased several times. I think now it's 3.25%, which is about 4 seats in the Knesset needed. Of course, clearly there are advantages in raising the threshold, making sure you have less parties. It makes the process easier. You have winners and losers, and it forces different smaller factions that have that are closer ideologically to join together, which is actually what happened to the Arab parties, and that's the reason we have the joint Arab list right now, because they fear that with the higher threshold they won't get represented. I think there is value in having many voices in this type of system, and even though it complicates issues, I think smaller parties that represent specific sectors, especially in a society like the Israeli society that isn't divided only by right and left, but also by ethnicity and religion, and newcomers versus older Israelis that were born in Israel, settlers versus those are against them. It's not only ideological, and I think the fact that there is this diversity of representation in the Knesset is kind of useful for the Israeli society. Either way, I don't think there's another increase in the threshold being discussed right now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one more question with regard to the parties, and then we'll move on to some of the issues. Can you describe how Gantz's blue and white partners really felt at a human level when he decided to join a government with Netanyahu? Yair Lapid, for instance, feels Gantz and Ashkenazi betrayed them and they could never join forces again, or in Israeli politics, never say never.
Well, it's definitely never say never, because Yair Lapid feels, probably rightly so, that he was betrayed by Gantz, and the only reason they joined their parties together was because they both believed that they could kick Netanyahu out, and that in no way they should have Netanyahu as prime minister. Yair Lapid came from a position of power. He was the bigger party, the bigger part of Kachol Lavan at the beginning. Then he was promised some kind of a rotation with Gantz. He gave up that too, and definitely he feels betrayed. But that's the beauty of the system, is that, you know, what's true for now isn't true for tomorrow morning, you know. And if a situation will come about in which Gantz maybe is fed up by Netanyahu, Yair Lapid feels that that's their chance to get Netanyahu out, they will join forces despite everything. And by the way, it's true on the other side as well. Think of the awful things that Netanyahu said about Gantz before the elections, and now they're partners. Think about the ongoing feud between Netanyahu and Bennett and Ayelet Shaked from Yemina. And once they're in the coalition, once they're out of the coalition, it's politics, nothing personal here.
Thank you. In terms of annexation, where is the Palestinian Authority in all of this?
So do you want to start?
You can answer. I mean, from what I know is
Yeah.
they've sort of put up their hands and said, we're not going to do anything, which I'm not sure if that is really the right move.
Yeah. Basically, what Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, said, you know, this is a total breach of the Oslo Accords, which means that all the agreements with Israel are null and void now. The Palestinians, and it should be said, have very little power. They have their resistance is very limited. They're against it. They can try appealing to the international community, but frankly, the interest of the international community on the Palestinian issue isn't the same as it was a decade or two or three ago. So it's not as if the world will come out and stop Israel just because Abu Mazen appeals to the world. The Europeans will a little bit, left parties around the world, but it's not what it used to be. They don't have the diplomatic clout they used to have. They don't have the power, the military power, or any other type of power to actually make Israeli life miserable. And Abbas isn't that kind of a leader. He doesn't. If there's one thing that we know about his extremely long rule of the Palestinians, I think we're 10 years past the last elections or more, is that he's averse to violence. Israelis may not believe it, but he's actually he's the one who has stopped and helped prevent terrorism more than anyone else. Now, how active will he be right now in making sure that military cooperation continues on a certain level, that there is action against terrorism? He'll probably be less enthusiastic about doing it, but I think he still believes, and the Palestinian leadership in general believes, that given their very bad options, renewing the Intifada or taking on some kind of terroristic military operation wouldn't be their advantage right now. So they have very limited options.
I see. I guess I just see there are a few questions kind of based off of that. Does that mean the two-state solution is dead?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's a tough question. I mean, supposedly the Trump plan is based on the two-state solution idea, but it carved up the area in a way that doesn't really leave another state, and it was done without a partner on the other side, so that won't advance the two-state solution. The Israeli public, which used to be, I think, kind of split half-half between those who believe that you should have a Palestinian state right now and those who are saying, well, not really. Right now, I think the consensus is that even though everyone agrees that that's not the issue right now, and that it's not viable right now, and that the Palestinians are not a worthy partner, and that there's no way to reconcile the rule of Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and that Israel has other issues to deal with, and that it would be too complicated to get into a big fight with the settlers. All these together have made Israelis either reject the two-state solution or more likely just lose interest in the two-state solution. Now, it doesn't mean that if the two-state solution is off the table, that there's a one-state solution on the table, that people support that idea. But I think there's this understanding that there's a certain status quo now that can and should be continued. That's what the Israeli public opinion sees. To the question itself, is two-state solution dead? I mean, is there another solution? That's the question. And the thing is that it's becoming less and less practical right now, again, because of the reluctance of the Israeli public, because of the loss of interest in the world, even in the Arab world and the Palestinian cause, and because the settlements are growing and making it more difficult on the ground.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. And you mentioned the fears about national security working in Netanyahu's favor by sending more voters to him. Does that mean that annexation of parts of the West Bank is a win-win situation? Either will it be accomplished as a fait accompli, or will it lead to armed conflict, which will drive more voters to Netanyahu? Basically a win-win.
Again, I'm not trying to suggest in any way that Netanyahu wishes to see any kind of armed conflict or any kind of national security threat to Israel, not at all. I do think that there is a situation in which, and it's probably true to other countries and other political systems as well, when you have a leader who's in place for so long, for more than 10 years, and on the other side, you have opposition leaders or challengers come and go. There is this mindset that kind of sets in with voters that, okay, you know, we may not like Netanyahu, but there's no one else around there. And the idea that there's no one else around there is that who else could deal with these huge challenges that Israel is facing? And we're not like any other country. It's not as if the question of the next leader will be Medicare for all or abolishing Obamacare. We're talking here about life and death situations, Iranian nuclear threat, concerns on the ground. Again, Hamas, Hezbollah, these are issues where you need someone who's seasoned, who is experienced, and the only person around is Netanyahu, by the mere virtue of him being around for so long. So I think at times of fear, at times of concern and threat, people tend to stick to the leader they know, even if they're critical of him, and just go back to the American elections in 2004 when George Bush got reelected.
Great, thank you. Sarah, is there anything else you would like to say?
No, I just wanted to thank both of you for such an interesting discussion.
Yes,
Thank
actually,
you.
and I would like to thank both of you. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions, but both Sarah and Natan, thank you so much for explaining things to us and making this whole election process a little bit clearer for us. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Please check out Moment's websites for many more articles about Israel on a variety of topics. Sign up for Natan's weekly newsletter, and please consider subscribing to the magazine and register for the upcoming Zoominars. Thank you very much.